Hey guys, so today we're going to be doing another individual horror movie review. We just have had so many original horror movies come out lately, and I am just so into it, so I knew I wanted to do all of the horror movie reviews that I could this month. I think I've done 4 individual movie reviews. I did Moonfall, which of course is not a horror, but this will be the last of the month that I talk about, and then we will do a Letterboxd recap this month where I share the other original horrors that I watched this month. But today we are going to be talking about Umma, which is a new movie that just came out, obviously, the same weekend that X came out. Why couldn't I remember X? I think it will be overshadowed by X, but I know Umma also has a more limited theater release, so I know there's a lot of you waiting to hear my opinion whether or not you should go see it in theaters. I would say go if you're willing and you are able to. Obviously not everyone can still go out, but I think it's important that we support these kind of, horror movies that are really original, especially in this, era of remakes, reboots, and sequels. It's not that we're not getting original horror, it's just they're being overshadowed by a lot of these remakes, reboots, and sequels. So I think it's important to support the individual or the more original horror movies when possible, like X and Umma. So this supernatural horror movie follows Amanda, who after a traumatic childhood can no longer be near electricity. She and her daughter operate a bee colony and have a honey business when Amanda's uncle shows up with her mother's remains. This sparks memories of her trauma and leaves Amanda with the ultimate fear of turning into her mother. So Umma is mother in Korean, and this is a Korean kind of folklore type movie. It kind of has commentary on being a Korean American and also coming from immigrant parents, but it does focus mainly on the relationship between mother and daughter and that generational trauma. So this is a directorial debut from Iris K. Shim, who worked closely with Sandra Oh on the movie, as well as Sam Raimi, who gave a lot of the horror input into making this movie through its development. Sandra Oh, who of course stars in the movie as Amanda, and Sam Raimi are both executive producers on the movie. And Umma, believe it or not, is actually another movie that was impacted by the pandemic back in early 2020. They were preparing to start the journey early 2020 when of course everything had to be postponed, and they were able to finally film it in fall of 2020. This was even before the vaccines and everything. So this was filmed quite a little while ago. So that's all kind of the backstory of this movie and how it was created. So let's get into my actual thoughts on this movie. So this is a PG-13 supernatural horror, and I think it's a pretty classic standard PG-13 supernatural horror, which if you've been around on my channel for a while, you know are some of my favorite type of movies. You know what you're going to expect from it. You know what kind of scares you're going to get, some of those ghosty images, a couple jump scares here and there. And for a directorial debut, I will say this was actually really, really strong, and overall, I'm a fan of this movie. I think it has its flaws, and we're gonna get into its criticisms, but first I want to talk about the things that I really liked about this movie. The horror in the beginning of this movie was so effective. I went and saw this by myself. It's actually the first movie I've seen by myself, I think, since before the pandemic. I think it's been that long since I went to a movie by myself, and it was me and like 2 other older ladies. So it was a vibe. Anyway, the horror in the beginning of the movie, the reason why I brought that up is because it was actually kind of terrifying in the beginning. And it's just the kind of horror that's effective for me. It's not going to be the kind of horror that scares everybody. But I prefer these kind of horrors to your traditional slashers. I just like ghost movies and supernatural movies more than anything. But I loved the horror in the beginning of this movie specifically because it wasn't accompanied with like booming music or a jump scare. It would be, you would just kind of see something moving in the background a little bit. And to me, that was very effective. This, of course, has been done in other horror movies, but that's like my favorite kind of horror, is where you just kind of like barely see something going on and your imagination fills in the rest. You don't need a jump scare to see it, you know what I mean? It's just very ominous imagery and very subtle, simplistic horror, and that's what I love. So if you like that kind of stuff, you'll probably like Umma. I definitely wanted more of that. I feel like the beginning of this movie is where it was really, really strong and where the horror was the most effective. And I do feel like throughout the movie, the horror was a little bit lacking. I feel like I wanted a lot more horror. I liked the Korean culture throughout this movie and the different kind of folklore throughout it. The director herself is Korean, so it was nice to kind of see her bring in those concepts with the horror elements and everything in the movie. The performances were really good. I don't feel like they stood out to me very much. Like, they were strong, they were believable, but nothing like too spectacular. I think Sandra Oh did a great job though. I really like the story. I like the telling of her kind of dealing and struggling with her PTSD from her abuse that she got from her mother as a child, and how that kind of impacts her life now of not being able to be around electricity, telling people that she would get very sick, when in reality, her being sick is basically having panic attacks. And I was not expecting any of that layering of story to this. I thought it would be pretty straightforward of her mom kind of passes away and then she gets her remains and her mom begins haunting her. I wasn't expecting this layer of abuse and trauma and her dealing with the PTSD and having it all be triggered again by receiving her mother's remains. I like the idea that they took the fear of becoming your mother. I think there's many people in the world, not myself, I love my mom, I think she's great. If I turn into her, that'd be fine with me. She reads like a book a day, so you know, I would love that, but I think a lot of people have that fear of turning into their parents, right? I think on some level we're like, I want to break out of that, you know, pattern, or I don't want to become them. You know, a lot of people have that fear. So I think it's a really interesting take on making it a horror movie, of embracing that fear and making that the true horror elements of it. I thought that was genius. And then underlining that generational trauma with also her mom's backstory a little bit. And we get to see how that kind of played into her abuse. Now let's move on to some critiques. Overall, I liked the movie. It was pretty solid, but I do think it has some faults. So let's get into those. Like I said, I needed more horror. I feel like they held back a lot. This would be a great movie for someone who's not really, you know, into horror that much, or you're scared easily. I think this one is a great beginner horror in that sense, because they could have pushed the horror so much more. And I wish what we did see of the mother, I wanted it to look a little bit different. I wanted to look a little more horrifying. And it was kind of your standard cliche type of horror imagery, which works in this movie, but it makes it more run-of-the-mill. It makes it more average and makes it to where you know what you're expecting from this kind of movie. This almost feels like a horror movie from the 2010s, which isn't a bad thing because, you know, we got some really great supernatural horror from the 2010s. I feel like that was the genre that was really popular and what really stands out from the 2010s. But it does follow that 2010 PG-13 supernatural horror formula that a lot of movies back then would do. And it just came to be a little bit expected. Once I noticed the kind of horror they were doing, although I liked it, I kind of knew what to expect going forward. Speaking of expected, this movie was a little bit predictable. Nothing ever caught me off guard. Nothing ever surprised me, and I don't think that was their intention. I don't think they're, you know, trying to come up with twists or anything like that. But I was disappointed that it didn't take it to different places. I think with what they had to work with, it was, you know, effective. It was good, but I feel like they could have pushed everything just a little bit more. I just wanted a little bit more out of everything in this movie. I think there's so much you could do with this kind of concept and this kind of story. The story itself is so original and unique, and that's really the standout of this movie and made it a story that I've never really seen be told before, but then they turned it into a movie I've seen before. So I think there were a lot of other things that they could have done to make this movie a lot more original, because the story itself was so original. That's basically all the criticisms I have of it though. Otherwise, it's a pretty solid movie. It kind of is in the middle point as far as like quality wise and like would I recommend it? For some people, absolutely. I think you'll really enjoy this. For me personally, it's going to be such an easy rewatch. I could definitely see myself owning this on DVD, rewatching it, you know, just on a random day. You know, just if I'm in the mood, it's definitely a rewatch for me. That doesn't mean it's spectacular. It didn't blow me away or anything. There was definitely some things missing from it and some things that I wanted more out of this movie, but otherwise it's a pretty solid movie, especially for a directorial debut and for an original horror. If you enjoy PG-13 supernatural horror as much as I do, definitely go watch this. I can't say that for everyone. Not everyone's gonna love this movie. It's not gonna be everyone's favorite. It's not everyone's favorite type of genre, so use your own discretion discretion whether or not you want to watch it based on that. I don't recommend everyone rush out and see this ASAP, obviously, like I did with X, but it's going to be for a select few that will really get something out of the theater experience with Umma. It's a solid ghost movie, great setting, good performances, and the amazing storytelling. That's my favorite part, hands down. You can definitely tell that that was Iris's vision and that was her strength. And then we have Sam Raimi coming in, doing most of the horror elements. And I feel like that was a really good balance, except that I wanted some more horror. I wish there was a little bit more of that. I would love to know if you've seen this movie yet. What are your thoughts? Are you going to see this movie? Does it look like something you'd be interested in? What are your thoughts on PG-13 supernatural horror? Personally, it's a favorite of mine, but I would love to hear what you think. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.